Welcome into the PFF podcast. Steve Palazzolo here, continuing our trip down memory lane, going through the history of Pro Football Focus. If you're just tuning in, please be sure to check out the archives. We're going through the old stories, everything that has shaped PFF, from founder Neil Hornsby to the architect of the PFF system, Ben Stockwell. It's all in the archives. Please be sure to check them out. You don't have to listen to them in order. Pick and choose who you want to listen to. But I've been calling it a great look, not only into the history of PFF, but for just business and business type of stories and tips and all sorts of stuff. I've actually learned a ton from my colleagues here, so please check out the archive. Today we're continuing with PFF Fantasy, but before we get into that, just going to ask for some quick help, really quick. It'll take 20 seconds of your life if you guys could just fill out a quick survey. The link to the survey is in the show notes. It's at survey.libsyn.com/PFF podcast. Go there, spend 20 seconds, fill out some information, and we'll learn more about our millions and millions of listeners. That'll be great to help the podcast moving forward. The one other thing that you guys can do, and there is huge reward here, it is to review the podcast. Give it a 5-star review, and you'll be in the running for a free PFF Elite subscription. Now, PFF Elite is pretty much everything you've ever dreamed of if you're a football fan, especially if you have fantasy football drafts coming up in the next couple months. It is everything you need to dominate in fantasy football using our award-winning fantasy football analysis and tools, the same stuff I used to win my hometown league and the many other leagues. I was in an experts league, quote-unquote experts league last year. Fantasy tools helped me win against these other experts. So it's a $200 value, and it's free, potentially. You have a chance to win this free PFF Elite package. All you have to do is leave the 5-star review, and you'll be in the running to win that free subscription. So 5-star review. Be sure to say Steve is awesome in there. You can mention Sam and Mike if you want to, but say Steve is awesome. Leave the 5-star review, and you'll be in the running for that free $200 product. And don't forget the survey. The link will be in the show notes. Now that we have that stuff out of the way, let's talk about PFF Fantasy. I'm going to interview here in the next few minutes Mike Clay, the founder of PFF Fantasy, and then Jeff Ratcliffe, the current director of PFF Fantasy. Two interesting characters and important characters in the history and growth of PFF, because, you know, when you talk to the Godfather Neil Hornsby in that episode, he never intended for this to be, you know, to have anything to do with fantasy football, but we know the way football is going. Fantasy is huge, it's massive. Neil essentially kind of let Mike Clay take the reins and run with it. Mike did a fantastic job. He now works for ESPN, and Jeff has continued right where Mike left off and continued to grow PFF Fantasy in the fantasy team. And again, it's not really two companies, but there are, you know, the guys that kind of collect the data and do more of the football analysis side of it, and then the fantasy team takes that data, turns it into great fantasy products. There's not a ton of connection between those two teams. It's two essentially different teams working on different things. But the fantasy team has just done a fantastic job of taking these mounds of data and making them relevant in the fantasy community. So without further ado, let's get right into it, starting with Mike Clay and then wrapping it up with Jeff Ratcliffe. And I'm here with Mike Clay. I think we have to call Mike the Godfather of PFF Fantasy. Now we have the Godfather of PFF, Neil Hornsby, but Mike, is it fair to call you the Godfather of PFF Fantasy?
Well, I hope so. I mean, considering all that went into it back when we fired it up, you know, it was quite the run. Actually, you know what? If you asked Neil that question, he'd probably say yes too, because and I know we're going to get into this, but man, he does not like fantasy, Steve. He wanted nothing to do with this. I think until we started making money. That's probably about when he was interested. But
that's how he's grown. He's grown and evolved through the years. He now embraces fantasy because yes, it does. It pays the bills over here now. You know.
Yeah, you got it. Hey, I tried to tell him that for a long time. I mean, I think I told him that when we first started talking about this way back when I approached him with the idea. So it took a couple years of maybe losing a few bucks here or there, mostly out of my pocket, but because Neil was not interested in contributing. But it obviously turned the corner at some point, and then from there, once we started charging, man, it went nuts. It's just a great time for the fantasy industry.
Yeah, so let's go back and dive into some of those early years. So what were you doing before PFF Fantasy started, and then essentially how did PFF Fantasy start? How did you first get in touch with Neil? How did that whole relationship come about? Give me just some of that backstory, and what was the timing? Around what year did all this go down?
Yeah, it was around I want to say 2010. I think May 2010 is when we kicked off the site. Might have been 2011. I think it was 2010 though. But nonetheless, I had a small blog, Fantasy Depth Chart it was called. I'm sure a few listeners may have remembered fantasydc.com. Had a friend there, Daniel Smith, and we were kind of unhappy with the projections in the industry, and we wanted to get a little more innovative. We started blogging there, and he actually mentioned Pro Football Focus to me first. He came across it and said, "Hey, check this site out." I went over, and back then it was very barren, as you remember. There was some data there. I don't believe there was content at that time. There was actually forums at that point. I remember way back when. So I thought, hey, there's some good information here. It's new. That's what I'm interested in. And I approached Neil and said, hey, do you ever think about doing some fantasy? He said no. But we talked a little bit. There was actually someone else, Kevin Greenstein, who was with the site for a long time, approached him as well from a different angle, completely separate from me, and we both had the same kind of idea, so we worked together on it, and it kind of evolved from there.
Yeah, so right around 2010, you said that's when it started. The funny thing is, I was still playing minor league baseball at the time. I had a teammate. We had a league for our team, so 10 or 12 of us together. And there was one guy on my team who was like, "Oh, I got this secret weapon. I don't want anybody to know." And I found out later it was PFF. That was like his secret weapon for fantasy that year. And I was like, "Come on, man, that's old hat. I've been a fan of that site for at least a year now. Come on, I've been." Even though the fantasy stuff was new, but I thought that was funny. And then a year later, was working for PFF. So now 2010, you kind of started the whole thing, and then how have you seen that grow? 2010, 11, 12, 13. How did that grow? How has the industry grown since then? Because I feel like the growth has really coincided back and forth between just PFF and the fantasy industry.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't take long for us to start having some success. I mean, we started going to the FSTA conferences, which if you were coming up in the industry or have a small business, you have to go there, meet a lot of people, whether it's on the content side or the people behind the scenes. And just meeting people, and they were familiar with our work, certainly with Pro Football Focus, and that obviously helped get us projection deals, get content deals, stuff like that early on when we were not even charging or making money. Certainly we started putting the man hours in and creating draft guides. I remember the one year, and I'm surprised my wife allowed me to do this, but I put up 5 figures the one year just to get our draft guides printed and on newsstands, just because I knew getting the logo out there, getting people to see our work and just see, wow, this is way different than whatever else is on these newsstands. This is going to help me win my league and certainly get the data that PFF has as well, get people on the site. And it worked out. I mean, that paid off. And then we started adding subscription options and building a terrific staff. I mean, I can't say enough about Jeff Ratcliffe, of course, who you'll hear on this show. He actually emailed me when I was at Fantasy DC right toward the end and wanted to write there. And I said, hey, I might have a new opportunity here. We're working on something. And so he was one of the first analysts there. And he was just another guy at that point, just a guy interested in the industry who wanted to write about football on the side.
I'll be sure to mention that you called him just another guy, just a jag.
Yeah, I did. At that point, he was just a jag. But but I say that because over the years, we've had probably close to 100 different people write for fantasy at PFF. More people have left than are still on the staff, and that was the case even when I left. And there was a lot of people that spiked, and I thought, hey, this guy's a future at this company, could be full time, and they kind of faded away. But Jeff just worked his way up and just emerged and became that number 2, my right hand man, and now of course he's running the show and one of the best in the business. So just talented people around me really helped get the site to the next level. I mean, there's only so much you could do, and it's been incredible to watch its growth over the past man, what is it now? Only 6-7 years. It's hard to believe, really. Wow.
Yeah, but it's been a long time. I mean, 2010 feels like ages ago sometimes, depending on your perspective. You know, I think one of the interesting dynamics was the internal dynamics, or lack thereof, I guess, within the company. You know, because Neil wasn't terribly interested in fantasy, he kind of, you know, it was essentially run like two different companies. You know, PFF, we had the analysts at PFF, the non-fantasy section. We had, you know, different goals, different aspirations. We were doing the data collection, and then of course you were taking the data and figuring out the fantasy slant to it, and trying to sell a completely different product. What was that dynamic like? Because you said you were blogging before and you were trying to do your projections. How did that change when you got the mountain of data that we had at PFF, and basically just had you had full control? It's like, here's all this information, figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, for a long time it was called the Mike Clay stat feed on the site. If you went in behind the scenes, that we built that. We got all the categories I was interested in, certainly, and kept evolving from there. And it was great. I mean, by the time I left, I mean, I almost still feel part of the family. But when I left, I still had not gotten into everything that was there. You know, route data, certain things like that. But it was awesome. It was really fun to spend countless, we'll say even months in the off season, just trying to find ways to use that to impact the projections, make the projections better. And it was just one step at a time, make them 1% better here or there. And there was just so much data. It was a lot to go through, but it was great. It was valuable. And, it obviously just keeps getting better year and year. But you're right. I mean, it very much was two separate companies. I mean, on several occasions, Neil would straight up tell me it is two separate companies. You know, we actually talked at times about building our own website, because there was you'd have Ian Perks, of course, as a tech. He's outstanding at his job, but that we had Eli Horton doing some tech stuff. I'm not sure if he still is. He was doing tech stuff for fantasy, and they would butt heads sometimes. You know, it was like we want to build this tool for fantasy, but it doesn't work with this site. And we talked to Neil about that. We almost did that not long before Chris Collinsworth, of course, bought the company. But yeah, there was a lot of back and forth with that, and Neil just letting me run the show. But I got to say this. There were times he and I butted heads, but I appreciated him allowing me to do what I wanted with it. He really set us up for success, allowing myself and Jeff to run the show, and I think it obviously paid off well.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that. I mean, I think the story of this entire podcast series has been that, you know, it's a lot of people working extremely hard to get stuff done. And there were obstacles along the way, and we always made sure that we pushed through. And I think that's why fantasy was able to have so much success through the years. And look, I've always used PFF Fantasy because I know that I trust the data, I collect the data, and then I think more importantly, though, you and Jeff and the massive team that you have done a good job of using the data to actually win at fantasy, to project players well, to understand the game, and I think that is extremely important. When I had Brian Hall, our Director of Business Development, on, or Rick Drummond, the guys who work with NFL teams, I think, you know, there's this perception that, well, if every NFL team has the same data, then they all have the same advantage. But the reality is there's 32 different teams doing things differently. So I think you guys deserve credit for taking this data and actually putting it to good use, to win at fantasy, to project players well, and to help me win at fantasy. I think that's the most important thing. I knew that I didn't even have to research anything. I just kind of break out my PFF fantasy tools the day before my draft or the day of my draft, and I'm feeling pretty good about my draft in my season. So I think that's a credit to you and Jeff and the entire team that you were able to put all this data to actual good use. And you know, I see you guys win awards all the time, whether it's with PFF and now outside of PFF.
Yeah, and I think that's been directly correlated with having that data and certainly the hard work that goes along with it. I mean, a lot, even today, I mean, you see a lot of this information starting to get out there. I remember when snaps were unheard of in the industry, and I started just tweeting them out right from Premium Stats, and then like Khaled or Sam or somebody would be like, "Hey, Mike, let's cut it down a little bit. You're just giving away the data here a little bit." So, but you know, the snaps were so uncommon. People love that stuff, and now it's just commonplace. But back in the day, especially, and even today, again, it's there, but you have to know how to use it. Depth of target, that was brand new coming from PFF, and I had to sit there and spend, again, weeks and weeks just trying to figure out how does this correlate, study this stuff. How does it correlate to yards per reception? How can we make our information better? So you're right, and it's just grown from there, more and more information, and it's led to awards. So we won. I still remember the first year we got best single site specialization for football. We won essentially the best site that only covers football for fantasy. We beat out NFL.com. We beat out Baseball HQ, which is Ron Chandler's site. I mean, some extremely great, respectable sites, and I think we've won that 3 years in a row now. Even this past year, with when I wasn't there, we won it as well. So that we won tons of accuracy contests. I'm as I talk to you, I'm looking at my shelf here with ranking accuracy, projection accuracy. We've won countless writing awards from, and I've only won 1 or 2 of them. The staff really around me has carried the load there. They've been outstanding. So. Again, it's just a credit to the hard work and the data. You guys who have compiled it all, it's been just a great combination of effort and talent.
Yeah, so even though there were times where I didn't always know what you guys were doing, and you guys may not have always known the process and what we were doing, it was truly a team effort, PFF and PFF Fantasy.
For
and
sure.
It's been fun watching the whole thing evolve through the years, especially as fantasy has grown immensely. And now you're at ESPN, and that was obviously a big move for you. I don't know how much you want to get into that, and not necessarily the decision to move, but you had a good opportunity there, and we get to see you on TV a little bit and hear you on podcasts, and what else are you doing over at ESPN, and how has that gone for you as far as what you're able to do over there now versus what you were doing, and what's that whole scene look like from your?
Well, I'm not the boss anymore, so there's pluses and minuses to that. I don't have to worry about deciding who gets a $40 stipend and $60 stipend and sit in on the meetings that Jeff has to sit in on now. But I don't miss a lot of that, but I do miss kind of the camaraderie of the. We built it. I still feel like PFF Fantasy is my baby. It always will be. Always be part of the family as long as I'm welcome. Of course, I'll try just to say nice things about PFF on Twitter.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
But no, it's been great. Luckily, ESPN and PFF have a terrific relationship over the years, and we'll hope that continues. And again, just switching over here to ESPN. It has allowed me to focus more on content. That's the true love for most of us, not really the business side, and that was part of it. So, it was a hard decision. I know some people think that's insane, that it was. I've had people kind of widen their eyes when I've said that. They don't actually believe that I had to sit here and grind through this for weeks. You actually gave me a lot of advice on that. We spoke before I made that decision. It was hard, when you build something like this. So. But nonetheless, I think it worked out for the best. It would have been harder for me to leave if I didn't think Jeff could handle it, and that guy's outstanding. He's done a terrific job.
Yeah, apparently I gave you the wrong advice for the good of PFF. I guess I encouraged you to move on, but no, I mean it really was it seemed like that debate of, like you said, something that you had a huge hand in building, of course, and continuing to see it grow versus that established name of ESPN. So. I mean, I could understand that bit of a struggle as well, but again, it's been great watching the fantasy side of things grow. Again, it wasn't something that it wasn't in the cards. It wasn't going to be a part of PFF until you kind of came in and pushed for it to happen and we're all better off for it happening. And we'll get Jeff Ratcliffe on here in a little bit to discuss how that whole thing continues to evolve and how we're trying to take it even further to the next level. So, Mike, any lasting thoughts for our millions and millions of listeners here as far as PFF Fantasy, its evolution, and anything or anything specific to plug over at the big guy over at ESPN?
Well, it's the middle of the off season, so I won't plug too much. Just where to go. ESPN Fantasy for content, rankings, projections, all that stuff. Still doing the projections over there, which is some people love them, some people don't, I guess. But it is what it is. But I'm curious to see what Mr. Ratcliffe has to say. Make sure you ask him about his old boss.
I will. I'll ask him about Mike Clay and how Mike said that he was just a guy back in the day, but Mike is like a proud papa watching him evolve. Is that fair?
Oh yeah.
And grow.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he again over time he just emerged into more of a partner in the business than than an underling, if you will. So again, it was just a seamless handoff. Jeff's awesome, and I'm glad you guys, Chris, everybody stuck with him when I moved on. I know there was the interview process and stuff, but really it was an absolute no-brainer, and I think you guys probably know that now a year later.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff's been fantastic. We'll have him on here in a bit. So that is Mike Clay, the godfather of PFF Fantasy, now of ESPN Fantasy. And we are now joined by Jeff Ratcliffe, the director of PFF Fantasy. Jeff, we just had Mike Clay on. He was calling you just a guy and all sorts of stuff. We'll let you explain that. He said you were just a guy back in the day, but I think he was alluding to, you've evolved into a superstar of sorts in the fantasy community now. But welcome to the show, and appreciate you taking the time to just discuss your path at PFF, just like so many others.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to be a part of this. It's been fun listening to this because over the many years, I mean, I've been part of the story, but I haven't gotten all the stories sort of in sequence. Like I loved listening, especially the Neil podcast. That was my favorite by far because Neil's such an interesting guy, and the backdrop to this whole thing is sort of like his story is similar to all of our stories in some way, shape, or form. We all sort of found our way here. There was no sort of just direct path for any one of us.
Right. It's crazy, right? And that goes, it kind of flies in the face of everything you were kind of taught growing up, right? It's like pick a career and work toward it and all that stuff. And, nowadays it's almost like invent a career like Neil did, invent something, build something. And I've had a lot of fun going back through, and of course our listeners can catch the Neil Hornsby podcast, that episode in the archives. We've talked to Neil, we've talked to Ben Stockwell, the architect of PFF. We talked to Khaled, the self-proclaimed most important person at PFF. So we've got all sorts of backstory, and today we're talking about PFF Fantasy. We talked to Mike Clay earlier on the episode, just discussing the history and how it started and how he kind of pushed Neil to start it, especially since Neil was creating a football site that wasn't necessarily going to be fantasy based. Mike kind of pushed him in that direction, made sure that we had a fantasy section. Where does your story begin, Jeff, as far as when you joined PFF? What's the timeline look like, and what were you doing before, and how did that all come together?
Yeah, so I have an interesting backstory because I actually have a PhD now, but I was in the process of going to grad school. I started in grad school in the early, I guess you can say mid-2000s, but 2003 when I started in grad school, and finally finished up in 2012. Yes, that's 9 years to get a PhD. But regardless, part of that was because I like to procrastinate a little bit. I like to, really dive into things that I'm really interested in, and thought the grad school route, that was the traditional route. You do this and you're going to be a professor, and then you live your life, blah, blah, blah. Well, it bored me a little bit, and I found anything I could to procrastinate. I was part of that big poker boom, so I was playing online poker in the mid-2000s. There were times where I was playing six-man or six-max, so it's like 6 players at a table, and then I would multi-table on screen, so I'd have like 6 screens of 6-table poker going on, so it's like no thought, like it was just everything had to be math, like quick decision, blah, blah, blah. And what's interesting is a lot of folks have a similar path to fantasy. So when that whole thing blew up, I was sitting there, it's 2010, and I'd been playing fantasy for, over 10 years at that point. And I was, fooling around with a little blog, but I thought, hey, maybe I could get published, because I can't obviously get published in academics isn't too much of a hack there. So maybe I can get published in fantasy. And I looked around, just did a quick Google search, like jobs, fantasy writing jobs. And there were a couple sites. One of them happened to be this site called Fantasy DC, which was run by Mike Clay. And I reached out to him. I'll never forget. He wanted a writing sample. And I wrote, I wrote like a puff piece on Beanie Wells. So yeah, it was really bad, but whatever.
And you got a job off of that?
I totally did, but now you know why I was just a guy. So I reach out to him, and he writes back, and he's like, I like what you wrote here because, hey, I know how to make an argument, even if it's a crappy argument. I could make an argument at that time. And he said, but I have a better opportunity if you're willing to wait around for about a month. And he said, have you ever heard of this site called Pro Football Focus? And I'll be bluntly honest, I had not. I really wasn't into the sort of analytics side, the data side at that point in terms of football. I knew about sabermetrics, et cetera, but never really applied it to fantasy for me. It was more of a feel thing. And I was a big fan of like Matthew Berry and stuff like that back in that time. So, I lied and said, yeah, I know what it is and I can do data. and then we started up from there. The one thing that I had to my advantage is I had played in some IDP leagues, and that was sort of my initial foot in the door. Was I was writing a little bit on offense and a little bit about IDP, and honestly, it just kind of started from there. Didn't really think anything of it. I mean, I was really proud myself, but in the same right, it was always weird to tell people like, yeah, I'm spending all this time and effort writing for a site and I'm not getting paid or, anything other than just the personal gratification of doing something I really enjoyed. So, yeah, it started from there. First year was real slow goings. And even then, like Mike, to comment off of the just the guy thing, when it came time, so Mike was doing all the work in the beginning. Like he was editing, he was doing everything. And he needed help editing. When it came time to pick some editors, he didn't even pick me. Like there were 3 dudes who were picked. I wasn't one of them. Like, that's how far down the totem pole I was at that point.
It's the Beanie Wells thing. He just never liked Beanie Wells. And
it probably is. Yeah, it probably is. I don't know. Maybe all the Star Wars references I insisted on putting in every single one of those original articles. But, about a year after that, I was made an editor, and then it just kept growing and growing from there, man.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't even realize a big part of your story. I'm learning a lot through the years, or through this whole, podcast series about how some of these other guys have evolved through the years. I've said it on multiple podcasts now too. I feel like this series is as much about business and, learning business and adjusting and just getting ideas about that as much as it is about football and fantasy football. So I do love the different avenues and angles that everybody comes from. We all have, something unique in our past, but we're unified by football, whether it's fantasy or not. I mean, it's all the same thing. We're all unified there. So, how have you seen that evolve? Now, you said that was 2010, right? Right when PFF Fantasy essentially started?
Yeah, so there's only 2 people left now from day one because Mike obviously had to go be a big shot and go on to ESPN. But it's just me and Tyler Lochner are the only 2 left from day one. We had a lot of folks back when it started. Mike was a great recruiter, and the beauty to what he did was, it was just as simple as, we can't pay you, but we'll give you, exposure, and you'll get access to all this great data. Like that was back in the first iteration of PFF Premium, and when nobody had seen anything like that before. That didn't exist. Like Pro Football Reference existed, but it wasn't the same. It was so much better. So free access to that. And then over the many years now, it's crazy. If we went off and we listed all the people who have written for us on the fantasy side, it'd have to be, 150 names easily. And some of them have gone on to get full-time jobs elsewhere. Obviously, Mike is elsewhere now. JJ Zachariason is the editor-in-chief at Number Fire. Mike Tagliere has a full-time job at Fantasy Pros. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. It's pretty amazing when you think about that. And, to go off of what you're saying, like this is a podcast about business as well. Part of it is occupying space that nobody occupies and creating a market where people don't even realize there is a market, right? And that's exactly what we did. For the longest time, fantasy analysis was you had folks who wrote for major media companies, and the advice was start this guy because I said so. Because I write for this 3-letter network or this 4-letter network, start this guy.
Right.
Well, we came along and said, I'm nobody. You don't even have to listen to me, but here's why you probably should start this guy. Here's why I'm starting him. Here's all of this information. And these are the reasons why this makes sense and why this doesn't make sense. And then it just went from there. It's almost like innovation begets innovation. It just sort of became this snowball. And the fun thing is there was a little bit of competitive camaraderie going on in and amongst ourselves. Like I came up with this stat, and then somebody else comes up with a better stat, and it's like, oh man, I want to see what else I can find. So it just really started to snowball there over the first couple of years. But we're still making no money. We have no money all this time. I'll never forget. So I was at a Jimmy Buffett concert. This had to have been 2011. And it was like right after, maybe a year or so. And I thought, okay, I can really do this. I used to count the articles, by the way. It's like, now I've written 4 articles. Now I've written 5. Now I've written 6. Like now I don't even know where the heck I would be. It would be hundreds upon hundreds. But
I want an official count by the end of the show. Get an official count through the years.
We got to get somebody to build a spreadsheet for that or something. But I was at a Jimmy Buffett concert with family, so it was like a big bus and everything. And it was, those are always fun, tailgating. So we're tailgating, playing cornhole and stuff like that. And I had aunts and uncles were there too. Like everybody's hanging out. And I'll never forget, like I had mentioned that I was writing fantasy, and I said, hey, maybe it turns into something. Maybe it's a slightly different career. Who knows? And I'll never forget the look of horror and disgust on my aunt's face when I said that. Like, what the heck is wrong with you? But, that was in that time period. We weren't making any money. Everybody thought we were crazy. And then somehow we started making money. I mean, we started selling subscriptions. And I think it was 2012, but don't quote me on that 100%. All I know is that my first payment wasn't actually money. It was a trip to Vegas for the Fantasy Sports Trade Association conference. So it wasn't really a trip to Vegas. I mean, it was fun. Don't get me wrong. But either way.
That's as good as money, Jeff. That's as good as money.
Hey, for me, it was the coolest thing ever, though, because I really didn't fly or anything. I didn't go anywhere. I was a lowly grad student. So it was a lot of fun. And then being there and standing next to some of these people who I'd watched on TV or I'd read, their columns online, and then just standing next to them, rubbing shoulders with them was a really humbling and in the same right inspiring thing that showed that, we can really do this. Like we're here. We can really do this. And then it just started to keep going. It kept going from there. And largely, Mike deserves so much credit, because he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and promoting, and he did such a great job to ultimately get us to that tipping point.
Yeah, here's the point I made to Mike, and I've used the PFF fantasy data for years now, because I don't necessarily have the time to view the game through fantasy eyes all the time, but I do trust that when I open up my PFF fantasy tools, that research and everything's been done pretty much for me and pointing me in the right direction. So I've had good success in my leagues, even though obviously I have a baseline of knowledge about the NFL, but it's applying that general fantasy knowledge that I think is so valuable. But the point I made to Mike, you guys have access to this massive database the same way 28 NFL teams have access to this massive database, but just because they have all this data doesn't mean that they're using it the right way. And I made that point on previous podcasts with Brian Hall, with Rick Drummond. Teams are using it differently, some better than others. How do you guys, or look, I respect what you guys have done with the data, because you guys came up with either valuable tools, valuable information, or you applied the information in a way that helped you guys win leagues, helped other people win leagues, helped you guys win awards. How do you keep that process going? Because just having more data isn't, that's not the trick, right? It's making sense of it and then being able to apply it.
Yeah, both quantity and quality. I think it's different for different folks on staff. For me, I just have a lot of questions, and this is something I do even just in my everyday life that it drives my wife nuts sometimes. Is like, I have a question and I'm not going to be satisfied until I have an answer to that question. And it could be something stupid like, how many sons did Napoleon Bonaparte have? And then I go down that rabbit hole in Wikipedia where I'm reading about Napoleon's son, and then before I know it, I'm on Jim J. Baker's page or something like that. It makes no sense. Or Jim J. Bullock. What am I saying? Jim J. Baker. That's not even a thing. Jim J. Bullock, the random 80s sitcom star. It's just the way my brain operates. So I have questions about football all the time in the same right. And I don't always look at them as fantasy specific questions, to be honest with you. For me, it's football first, fantasy second, and then ultimately, if we get the answers to the football questions, we'll get the answers to the fantasy questions. So I'll come up with something in my head and then try and figure out a way to answer that question. And sometimes that can be a relatively easy answer. Just go into Excel and quick pivot table, and then bang, you have your answer. And then other times it can require some pretty extensive work that could be weeks or sometimes even months. Sometimes I'll put spreadsheets aside when I just get frustrated, and then I'll end up coming back to them, or maybe I never come back to them. That has happened before as well. And then my goal on staff is to get similar folks like that. Like Scott Barrett now is one of our full-timers, recent full-timer. So only the third ever fantasy full-timer at PFF other than me and Mike. And Scott has a unique way of thinking about things as well, and very analytic, and also has that creative mind where he's just always answering or asking something and coming up with new ideas. So I think that's a big part of it, is just to constantly there's never ending questions in football. And the beauty to the game as well is that even from when we started in 2010, the league is very different. There's a lot of changes that have taken place in this league, and that lends itself to even more questions that can be asked and then hopefully answered. And then again, like you said, we use this information to create the tools, and the users ultimately reap the benefits, hopefully.
Yeah, I love Scott and the addition, his addition to the staff, because he works so hard, and I think he has that kind of spirit of PFF, because everybody we've talked to on the podcast previously had that, work hard at all costs to do whatever their job is, whatever that job is, do it as well as you possibly can. And you could always see the wheels turning from Scott on Twitter, and he's always asking questions and answering questions, and he's doing a fantastic job already, just churning out content that kind of makes you think over on the PFF fantasy side. So I think that's been great, and it's good to see now we've got, we have more writers, we have more people, and I kind of like, is it really everybody's, you and Scott, everybody's just in their own unique position? Here's the data, and figure out stuff on your own, and you have a slightly different angle? Is that why we have different projections every week? And just you guys just have your ability to take the data, interpret it your own way, to create your projections and your outlook on fantasy in general?
There's definitely subjectivity there. That's certainly the thing with projections that I always harp on people. A friend of mine in the industry put it really well. When you design a projection model, it's kind of like a plane in some ways, because a plane can, for the most part, fly on autopilot, but somebody has to land it and take it off, right? You have to have a pilot there to do those sorts of things. So that's sort of my role, of tweaking and just oversight on the projections model. But yeah, what data inputs go into that obviously are subjective. That's what I've picked, and I'm sure what I use are going to be slightly different overall than what Mike used before me. But then, in terms of the analysis of our guys, that's what I think is so cool about the fantasy content on our site. Is sometimes, now we do say fantasy in the articles, but sometimes you could read the article, and if you kind of miss the word fantasy a couple times, you might think it was just a straight football analysis article. And I think that's what they do such a good job of. But we've always taken this hands-off approach. Like, I don't want to micromanage anybody on the staff and tell them this is what you need to be looking at or anything like that. And our folks have always been so good at just, like we've just said, like going out and trying to get answers to the questions that they have in their head. That's what gives us that sort of variety, hitting the problem from so many different angles. Ultimately, the problem is pretty simple. How do we score the most fantasy points? But there's so many different ways you can attack that problem.
Yeah, I like what you said about it, just kind of like that merging of fantasy and football, and just it's football, right? And when you get football information, it helps you answer fantasy questions intuitively. I think everything that we're doing on the website of Pro Football Focus is kind of pointing toward that right now. I think ESPN, even though ESPN's going through all their turnover right now and all that stuff, there's still this massive organization that can research and kind of have some foresight into the future. One of the things that stood out to me a couple of years ago is when they started taking former NFL players, the Tim Hasselbecks of the world, even when Trent Dilfer when he was there. I think Matt Bowen even when he was, when he's writing, there's a fantasy focus from former players and saying, hey, we're going to give you an X and O breakdown, and here's kind of that fantasy slant attached to it. I thought that gave a little bit of foresight that, fantasy is not only here to stay, but it is booming and bigger than ever. And, the meshing of not only someone that's going to, give you a schedule analysis and, projections and give you a fantasy slant, but also an X's and O's slant, and combining all of those different angles to kind of help you make better fantasy decisions. I think we're kind of in the middle of that, right now as an industry, and then loving what we're doing at PFF right now is we've kind of changed our content structure, reporting on every bit of news. You see that at ProFootballFocus.com right now, and then you guys are taking that and running with it, continuing the same content, but still being able to add a fantasy slant to every bit of news as well, and add all the various tools that we have with our new products. And that to me is the ultimate, that's the ultimate fantasy product. Essentially, you're getting every bit of news coming from the NFL. A lot of times you just say, how does this apply to me in fantasy? You can kind of see it, and then the tools are just pointing you in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's a wise man who we both know behind the scenes once said, "Good, better, best." And you have good stuff on the site that anybody can go and get. You don't have to subscribe to get all that news, and it's really good. It's fantastic. But if you want to take it to another level, we have that Edge product. And Steve, I know there's like super infomercially, but it's awesome. And I'm not going to joke about that. If I didn't work for the site, I'd still think this was awesome because it's three things that you had to buy separately last year in one for $40, which is insane. And then for the people who are off the deep end, this year is sort of the next level of fantasy and football products rolled into one with our elite product, which, Steve, it resurfaces something that people used to go nuts about is in a slightly new form. But the premium stats, that's gone. Really, it's not going to come back in its old form.
But we've heard the feedback, right? We've heard the feedback. People were begging for us to bring back some level of those premium stats, and a lot of stuff that we ended up having to take away a couple years ago.
Exactly, and it's coming back, which is great. I mean, it's one of those tools that you can kind of just get lost in. And so the value there isn't just for fantasy folks. Of course, if you play DFS, it's almost a must-have. But for football folks in general who really love their information, there's value there. Where there's just value in the Edge product because the NFL Draft Pass that you guys put together was pretty much one of the best things I've ever seen. More information about these players than you could get anywhere in the past. This year, everybody's so much more well-informed about everybody as well because of that in the draft. So, yeah, it's amazing where we came from because we had this sort of, like 8-bit, Windows 95 toolkit that we first came out with when we started the subscription plan. And now it's like it's a completely different level. I mean, the Draft Master tool where it's automatically suggesting picks and then it's dynamic as well. So it doesn't just run through if you run against a computer. It doesn't just pick the same guys over and over again. It's really amazing what the IT folks on our team have done. And yeah, I look back after 7 years and I see what the site looks like now. And if you would have told me that we would have covered this much ground 7 years ago, I would have thought you were as crazy as my aunt thought that I was to go into fantasy because there just no way. It's amazing. It truly is.
It's great when you put it into that perspective, though, and you say 7 years and here's how far we've come, because sometimes you get lost in that day-to-day. We're entrenched in, what are we doing next and how are we going to evolve? But it is true when you kind of take a step back and see what we have. So, the things you're describing, the PFF Edge product, the PFF Elite product, we really came into this offseason saying, look, we've been splitting up products, and here's an NFL product, and here's a fantasy product, and here's a draft product, and we just said, look, if you are a diehard football fan, we want you to live on PFF, and if you just show up for the news articles, fine. But we want you to live on PFF with Edge, with Elite, and get all of that. So everything you need for fantasy, everything you need to be informed for the NFL draft, our player grades, all of that rolled in to the Edge package, and then the Elite package, like you said, for our many, many extremely hardcore fans. I mean, we do have a big chunk of fans who are like, look, if you put something out, we're getting it because we know it's the best football information out there. So, yeah, a little infomercially. I don't care because it's our time to say, Jeff, the fantasy side and both sides of the company, it's like this big coming together, and you just show up and you get it all. And we're trying to really build that community at PFF. So let me have you wrap it up with just what, anything that you want our listeners to know about your journey, the fantasy journey as a whole, where we're going, and where's the company going as a whole. What should people expect in the coming years?
I think the beauty to fantasy as a whole is that it isn't Dungeons and Dragons for sports nerds anymore, that it is so mainstream, and we've seen that so many people who once were detractors are now buying into it, including people at this very company. It's amazing to see that transition. And I think a big part of it is how savvy people are who play fantasy now about football. They understand football at a level they didn't 10 years ago. So that's only going to continue. And we're going to be a big part of that conversation and continue to push that forward at PFF, continue with the innovative content. And the fun thing is, right now, we used to think 1 year at a time, and we used to start that year in February when the Super Bowl was over.
Right.
We're already planning 2018, and in my head, I have 2020 already planned. Like the stuff that we want to accomplish from a new and innovative way of leveraging the data that we have, both in content and in tools. That stuff, like, we're looking 5 years down the road, and who knows even what happens during that span of time. But, I think the progress we've made over the last 7 years, I think we're going to cover that ground plus some in the next 3 years. So a lot of big things to come for us, not just the fantasy part, but the entire site of Pro Football Focus.
And just to piggyback on that, it is because we've put more resource into it. So we now can plan for 2019, 20, 21, whatever it might be. And all I know is our marketing team has said our goal is to get you in PFF Edge, get you in the Elite product, pay this good low price, and then just keep adding to it. So when you come up with the next big thing next year, the year after, it just gets added to the package, and hopefully keeping those prices down. I know that's the market. I know that's the goal. That's what they've told me. That's the goal. So everything, all those great thoughts that you have in the future, all the thoughts that we have on the draft side, the goal is to roll that all into the same package, and you're just kind of locked in for life. So we do encourage everybody to check out those PFF Edge and Elite products, because I think as good as they are right now, they're only going to get better. So, Jeff, I just want to thank you for taking the time out. That is Jeff Ratcliffe, the director of PFF Fantasy. And that'll do it for today's PFF podcast. Special thanks to Mike Clay, taking busy time out of his ESPN schedule, and of course Jeff Ratcliffe, director of PFF Fantasy. I cannot reiterate this enough. The stuff that we have in PFF Edge and PFF Elite especially helps you win fantasy championships. There's a lot more to it as well, but I'll tell you, that is all I use. Sometimes I just spend that one day and cram, as I was telling them. I spend that one day and cram, and I have what I need to win my league. So I cannot push those products enough. Special thanks to Mike and Jeff. And if you want to get in on that PFF Elite product, you have a chance. All you have to do, go right now, iTunes, give us a 5-star review, leave your name, leave an email address, or Twitter handle. Very important. Leave an email address or a Twitter handle, and you'll be in the running to win a free PFF Elite subscription. It's a $200 value. Like I said, helps me win my fantasy leagues, helps everybody at PFF win awards at the Fantasy Awards. Fantastic information, $200 value. There's going to be some great NFL draft information that we're adding to it. All of our PFF player grades are in there. So go to PFF Elite or go to the PFF podcast, leave the 5-star review, leave your name, Twitter handle, or email address, and you'll be in the running to win that free $200 product. And then if you guys could please spare 20 seconds of your life and fill out the survey The link is in the show notes, but it's survey.libsyn.com/PFF podcast. Click the link, spend about 20 seconds, answer a couple questions. We would be forever grateful. But thanks again to our fantasy guests, Mike Clay, Jeff Ratcliffe, bringing a slightly different spin to the History of PFF podcast. If this was your first episode, please be sure to check out the archives. I think they've flowed nicely and really given some deep down insight as to what has gone into the construction of this company. Next week, talking to the big boss, it's Chris Collinsworth, talking about how he bought the company, why he bought the company, where the value is, where we're going, and some great insight into who I think, not biased at all, I think is the best color commentator in the NFL right now, or maybe in all of sports. Not sucking up to my boss at all, but it's the truth. Chris does his homework, and I think that'll really show through when we get him on the podcast. So thanks again for listening. Go leave your 5-star review. Go fill out that quick survey, and we will talk to you guys next week.